The dawn had barely broken when Manny Pacquiao's alarm went off at 5:47 a.m. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning unit in his hotel room, watching the first hints of pale light creep through the blackout curtains. At 58 years old, he still maintained the discipline of a fighter, his body conditioned by decades of early morning training sessions and rigorous routines. Even in retirement from professional boxing, his internal clock refused to deviate. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the plush carpet, and took a moment to breathe deeply. The flight to Manila was scheduled for 9:15 a.m., and he deliberately booked an early departure to avoid the midday crowds that plagued the airport terminals. As he moved through his hotel suite, Pacquiao caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was recognizable but deliberately understated. His face, weathered by years of combat and now softened by age, bore the unmistakable features that fans across the globe would recognize instantly. But that was precisely why he had chosen his travel attire with meticulous care. A simple gray hoodie, one size too large to obscure his frame, hung loosely from his shoulders. A navy baseball cap, unmarked and unremarkable, was already perched on his head. Dark sunglasses, the kind that could be purchased at any convenience store, sat on the nightstand, ready to be deployed if needed. He wanted to be invisible today, just another traveler moving through the airport like a ghost, indistinguishable from the thousands of other people flowing through the terminals. The elevator ride down to the lobby was mercifully empty. Pacquiao stood alone, watching the numbers descend, his mind already preoccupied with the meetings that awaited him in the Philippines. There was a business venture to discuss, a charity event to oversee, and several familial obligations that required his personal attention. Being Manny Pacquiao meant being pulled in 1,000 different directions simultaneously, each demanding a piece of his time and energy. The life of a legend extended far beyond the boxing ring. It encompassed business dealings, political responsibilities, charitable commitments, and the endless expectations of a nation that had elevated him to the status of national hero. The lobby of the hotel was beginning to stir with early morning activity. A few business travelers checked out at the front desk, their expressions tired and hurried. Porters moved luggage with practiced efficiency. The concierge smiled politely as Pacquiao passed, showing no sign of recognition, a testament to how well the disguise was working. He had tipped the hotel staff generously upon arrival, and they had understood his desire for discretion without being explicitly told. This was the unspoken protocol of traveling as a celebrity. Blend in, move quietly, and appreciate those who respect your privacy. His driver was waiting outside, the black sedan idling at the curb with its engine running softly. The man had been with Pacquiao for 3 years and understood the routine perfectly. There would be no unnecessary conversation during the ride to the airport, no media questions or small talk. Instead, they would travel in the kind of comfortable silence that only developed between people who had spent considerable time together. The streets were relatively empty at this early hour, and the drive to the airport took less than 40 minutes. As they merged onto the main highway, Pacquiao gazed out at the pre-dawn landscape, watching the city transition from darkness into the pale blue of early morning. When they arrived at the airport, the terminal was already bustling with early morning travelers. Pacquiao had traveled through this airport dozens of times over the years, and he knew the layout intimately. He knew which check-in counters were typically slower, which security lanes attracted the fewest crowds, and which restaurants in the terminal served the best coffee. This knowledge came from years of experience, from learning the patterns and rhythms of travel that most people never bothered to study. His team, a small group of 3 people consisting of his personal assistant, a bodyguard, and a business associate, emerged from the vehicle behind him, each carrying their respective luggage. The check-in process was his first real test of the day. Would the airline staff recognize him? Would there be a commotion? As he approached the counter, the agent barely glanced up from her computer screen. She took his passport with the kind of indifferent efficiency that suggested she dealt with hundreds of passengers every single day. The name on the document clearly meant nothing to her. She asked the standard questions in a monotone voice. Did you pack your own bags? Has anyone unknown to you asked you to carry anything on this flight? Pacquiao answered each one patiently and honestly, and within minutes, his boarding pass had been printed and his luggage was being whisked away on the conveyor belt behind the counter. Walking toward the security checkpoint, Pacquiao felt the subtle relaxation that came with successful anonymity. He had made it this far without incident, without drawing attention, without the kind of public spectacle that could delay his departure or complicate his travel. His team followed a few steps behind him, maintaining the kind of distance that suggested they were unrelated travelers rather than an entourage. His boarding pass was clutched in his hand, his documents organized and ready for the security officers who would inspect them at the checkpoint. The security line snaked through the terminal like a metallic river, dividing travelers into different lanes based on some incomprehensible algorithm that airport security seemed to operate on. Pacquiao had selected what appeared to be a relatively short line, one with perhaps 6 or 7 people ahead of him. He could already see the checkpoint ahead, with its conveyor belts and metal detectors, its bins for shoes and bags, its atmosphere of mild chaos and controlled order. He had no way of knowing, as he approached that security checkpoint with his team trailing behind him, that something in a computer system somewhere had flagged his name. He had no idea that a database error, a clerical mistake, or some algorithmic confusion was about to transform this unremarkable Tuesday morning into an experience he would never forget. He had no warning, no premonition, no sense of the 9 minutes that were about to unfold. In this moment, he was simply Manny Pacquiao, an aging boxer trying to make his flight on time, unaware that the universe had other plans for how this morning would unfold. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal continued their characteristic hum, the mechanical rhythm of modern travel continuing its endless cycle. People pushed luggage, children cried, announcements echoed overhead about gate changes and boarding calls. It was an ordinary morning at an ordinary airport, and Pacquiao, for all his fame and accomplishments, was just another passenger moving through the system. But in exactly 90 seconds, everything was about to change. The security checkpoint loomed ahead like a necessary gauntlet that every traveler had to navigate. Pacquiao's eyes scanned the setup with the familiarity of someone who had passed through security thousands of times. The conveyor belts moved in an endless loop, a mechanical river carrying shoes, belts, and carry-on luggage through the X-ray machine. The metal detectors stood like chrome sentinels, waiting to scrutinize every passenger who dared to walk between their pillars. Security officers in dark uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, their faces displaying the neutral expression that came from processing an endless stream of human beings, each one a potential threat that needed to be assessed and cleared. Pacquiao reached the check-in counter of his designated security lane. He had chosen lane 4, which appeared to have the shortest queue. There were perhaps 8 people ahead of him, a manageable number that suggested he would be through within 10 minutes, leaving him plenty of time before his boarding call. He began to reach into his bag to retrieve his boarding pass and passport, the documents already organized in his mind, ready to be presented the moment he reached the screening officer. His teammates had dispersed into different lanes, as had been their plan, to avoid drawing any attention to the fact that they were traveling together. As Pacquiao stood in line, waiting his turn, he became acutely aware of the ambient sounds of the security checkpoint. The beeping of the metal detector, the mechanical hum of the X-ray machine, the soft rustling of passengers removing their shoes and belts, the occasional muffled announcement about liquid restrictions and electronic devices. These sounds created a symphony of modern travel, a soundtrack that he had heard countless times before. His mind drifted slightly as he waited, thinking about the meetings that awaited him in Manila, the charity event he would be attending, the family members who would be expecting him. The line progressed methodically. One passenger cleared, then another, then a third. Pacquiao shuffled forward, his documents now in hand, his shoes already unlaced in anticipation of having to remove them. He was perhaps 4 people away from the actual screening desk now, close enough to hear the perfunctory exchanges between officers and travelers. Any liquids in your bag? Did you pack this yourself? Do you have any electronic devices? The same questions, asked hundreds of times a day, eliciting the same answers from thousands of passengers. That's when everything shifted. A senior TSA officer, a man in his 50s with graying temples and an expression of absolute authority, was standing at the side of the checkpoint. He wasn't actively processing passengers. Instead, he appeared to be supervising the overall operation, moving his gaze across the queuing lines with the watchful eye of someone in a position of oversight. His hands rested on his belt, and his demeanor suggested someone who had been in this position for many years, someone who had seen every variation of human behavior and security concern imaginable. The officer's eyes swept across the line, a routine visual scan that lasted only a few seconds. But then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze lingered. It caught on Pacquiao's face. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that seemed to expand in Pacquiao's awareness, the officer's eyes locked directly with his. There was no warmth in that gaze, no recognition in the traditional sense. Instead, there was something clinical about it, something that suggested the officer was checking Pacquiao against some mental checklist, some internal database of information. The officer's hand rose and he made a subtle gesture. It wasn't a wave, wasn't an invitation in the friendly sense. It was a deliberate, authoritative motion that cut through the ambient noise of the checkpoint and seemed directed specifically at Pacquiao. His index and middle finger bent inward slightly, a beckoning gesture that was unmistakably a command rather than a request. The officer's expression remained stern, his jaw set, his eyes unyielding. "Sir, please step to the side." The words were spoken with the kind of flat, bureaucratic tone that suggested they were delivered dozens of times a day. But to Pacquiao, they struck with the force of a physical blow. In an instant, his elevated heart rate began to accelerate. Adrenaline, a chemical companion he had known intimately throughout his boxing career, surged through his veins. His mind, usually so calm and collected, began to race with questions. Why? What had he done? Was something wrong with his documents? Had the airline flagged something suspicious in his luggage? "Me?" Pacquiao asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer's unwavering gaze and subtle gesture had been unambiguously directed at him. "Yes, sir, please step to the side. Secondary screening." Pacquiao moved out of his lane, acutely aware of the shift in attention that followed. Other travelers in the security line glanced at him, curious about what might have prompted this interruption. A few looked away quickly, respecting the implied privacy of a security matter. Others lingered, their eyes following him as he stepped out of the ordinary flow of the checkpoint and was directed toward a separate, clearly marked area cordoned off by red and white tape. The segregation was almost ceremonial in its formality. His team members, who had been progressing through their respective lanes, suddenly froze. Pacquiao caught their eyes across the checkpoint, and he could see the confusion and concern washing over their faces. His assistant, a young woman named Maria, made a subtle gesture asking if everything was okay, her eyebrows raised in concern. Pacquiao's bodyguard, a large man named Ramon, shifted his weight as if considering abandoning his own security lane to follow Pacquiao before seeming to reconsider. They had discussed protocols before traveling. If Pacquiao was ever stopped or delayed, they were to remain calm and continue with their own screening unless explicitly told otherwise. The secondary screening area was a stark contrast to the main checkpoint. It was quieter, more isolated, with high walls that created a sense of separation from the rest of the terminal. A single metal table stood in the center, and 3 additional TSA officers were positioned around the space, their expressions uniformly professional. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher in this area, more clinical, casting sharp shadows across the concrete floor. "Right this way, sir," the supervising officer said, his tone neither hostile nor friendly, simply official. "We need to ask you a few questions and do a secondary screening of your luggage. Standard procedure." Pacquiao nodded, moving into the secondary area, aware that dozens of eyes from the main checkpoint were now watching him. His boarding pass and passport felt suddenly heavy in his hands. His carefully constructed anonymity, the gray hoodie and baseball cap and dark sunglasses, suddenly felt like costumes that had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in this sterile, official space. "Please place your bag on the table, sir," one of the officers instructed, and Pacquiao complied, his mind still grappling with the sudden shift in his morning. This was not supposed to happen. This morning was supposed to be unremarkable, invisible, routine. But as he set his bag down and met the eyes of the three officers who were now studying him with unmistakable intensity, Pacquiao realized that the script of his morning had been rewritten, and he had absolutely no idea why. The secondary screening area felt smaller than it actually was, the walls closing in with an almost psychological intensity. Pacquiao stood at the metal table, his bag now positioned before the officers like an exhibit in a courtroom. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sickly pale glow across everything, draining color and vitality from the space. He could feel his heart still hammering against his ribs, each beat a reminder that something was fundamentally wrong, though he couldn't articulate what that something might be. The first officer to approach him was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and an expression of professional detachment. She wore her dark TSA uniform with the precision of military bearing, and her eyes seemed to catalog Pacquiao like a security system taking inventory of a suspicious artifact. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She simply began without preamble, pulling out a small notebook as if she had been waiting all morning for precisely this moment. "What is the purpose of your travel today, sir?" she asked, her pen poised above the notebook, ready to capture whatever answer he might provide. Pacquiao took a breath, forcing himself to respond calmly despite the cascade of anxiety flowing through him. "Business and family matters," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt internally. "I'm traveling to Manila in the Philippines. I have meetings scheduled and some charitable obligations I need to attend to." The officer wrote something down, her handwriting quick and efficient. She didn't look up as she asked the next question. "How long will you be staying in Manila?" "5 days," Pacquiao replied. "I return next Monday." Another notation in the notebook. The officer's face remained impassive, giving away nothing about whether his answers were satisfactory or whether they were deepening whatever suspicion had prompted his selection in the first place. Beside her, a second officer, a heavy-set man with a receding hairline and tired eyes, began examining Pacquiao's carry-on bag with methodical precision. He removed items one by one: a book, a laptop, a charging cable, a toiletries bag, each object placed carefully on the table as if it might be evidence in some investigation. "Do you have any checked luggage?" the female officer continued, still not meeting his eyes. "Yes, one suitcase," Pacquiao answered. "It went through the main conveyor belt." "Who packed your bag?" "I did myself." "And has anyone unknown to you asked you to carry anything on this flight? Has anyone given you anything to transport?" "No, nothing like that." The questions continued in this manner, each one following a script that Pacquiao recognized from his previous travels but had never experienced with such intensity of focus. "Has anyone approached you at the airport? Do you know anyone on the flight? Why are you traveling alone? When was the last time you traveled internationally? Do you have any items in your bag that could be considered dangerous or prohibited?" With each question, Pacquiao answered truthfully and completely, but he began to notice something unsettling in the dynamic. The other officers were conferring in whispered tones, occasionally glancing in his direction while maintaining their professional composure. Their whispers weren't angry or aggressive. If anything, they sounded confused, as if they were comparing notes on something unexpected, something that didn't align with whatever profile or flag had brought him to this area in the first place. A third officer, an older man with silver hair and a name tag that read Supervisor, appeared at the periphery of the interrogation space. He stood at a distance, observing the proceedings with the air of someone monitoring a protocol being followed. Pacquiao couldn't help but wonder if there was something specific they were looking for, something in his background or his recent activities that had triggered this level of scrutiny. "How frequently do you travel, mister?" The female officer paused, glancing at the passport she held in her other hand. "Pacquiao." "Multiple times a month," he said honestly. "I travel frequently for business." "And you're accustomed to these security procedures?" "Yes, I've traveled internationally for many years." The officer finally looked up from her notebook, and in that moment Pacquiao caught something in her gaze, a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it doubt? Confusion? Had something he said contradicted what she had been told about him? The pause stretched between them for a moment longer than felt natural, and then she returned to her questions. Time moved strangely in that secondary screening area. Minutes felt like hours, and Pacquiao found himself hyper-aware of every detail. The sound of the X-ray machine humming in the background, the shuffle of other travelers beyond the partition, moving through the main checkpoint unaware of the drama unfolding in this isolated space. The occasional crackle of a radio, voices speaking in codes he didn't understand. His bodyguard Ramon, somewhere beyond the walls, probably packing and consulting with Maria about what might be happening. The bag inspection continued. The supervisor moved closer, examining various items with what seemed like more curiosity than suspicion. He pulled out a neatly folded dress shirt, held it up as if studying its label, then carefully folded it back and placed it in the bag. He examined the laptop, asking Pacquiao to open it and turn it on to prove it was functional. Each of these checks seemed almost ritualistic, as if the officers were following a checklist that had been provided to them, checking boxes mechanically rather than based on any genuine concern. "Have you ever been flagged or stopped at security before?" the female officer asked. "Not that I'm aware of," Pacquiao replied honestly. "This is my first time being pulled aside for secondary screening." The moment those words left his mouth, he saw something shift in the officer's demeanor. A shared glance passed between them, the kind of look that suggested his response had been important, significant somehow. The female officer wrote something in her notebook with increased urgency, as if this fact was particularly noteworthy. Minutes continued to accumulate. The questioning became repetitive, cycling back to questions that had already been asked. Pacquiao began to notice a pattern. They were asking the same things again, as if trying to catch him in an inconsistency, in a moment where his story might change or falter. But his story didn't change because it was the truth. He was simply a businessman and philanthropist traveling to his home country to conduct business and charitable work. The supervisor pulled the female officer aside for a brief conversation that was intentionally kept low enough that Pacquiao couldn't hear. Whatever was being discussed seemed to generate some level of concern or uncertainty. The supervisor nodded, then turned to face Pacquiao directly, and for the first time, there seemed to be a question in his eyes rather than suspicion. "Mr. Pacquiao," the supervisor said, stepping closer, "we're going to clear your belongings. You should be free to proceed shortly." The relief that should have flooded through him was tempered by confusion. They were releasing him. But what had this all been about? Why had he been selected? What had they been searching for? The supervisor's expression suggested he was about to provide answers, but before he could speak, his radio crackled to life with an urgent message, and his attention was suddenly diverted. Pacquiao stood at the table, surrounded by officers who seemed suddenly uncertain, his questions still unanswered, the mystery of why he had been singled out remaining completely intact. The supervisor's radio crackled again, A burst of static followed by a voice that sounded distant and urgent. He held the device to his ear, his attention momentarily diverted from Pacquiao, his expression shifting from professional composure to something that resembled mild irritation. The secondary screening area fell into an awkward silence as the supervisor listened to whatever message was being transmitted through the secured channel. His jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded once, as if the person on the other end could see him. "Copy that," he said into the radio, his voice clipped and businesslike. "I'll be right there." He lowered the radio and turned back toward the female officer, the one who had been conducting most of the questioning. A brief exchange occurred between them, their voices low and rapid, the words indecipherable to Pacquiao. But their body language spoke volumes. The female officer's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, and she glanced at Pacquiao with an expression that seemed less interrogatory and more confused, as if she were reassessing something fundamental about the situation. The supervisor excused himself, moving toward the partition that separated the secondary screening area from the main checkpoint. He was gone for perhaps 2 minutes, though to Pacquiao, those minutes stretched like taffy. He stood alone with the other 2 officers, who seemed suddenly uncertain about what to do with him. The heavyset officer began to carefully repack his bag, folding items with an almost reverent care that suggested he was now treating the contents as innocent rather than suspect. When the supervisor returned, his entire demeanor had shifted. The stern authority that had characterized his initial observation was gone, replaced by something that resembled embarrassment mixed with dawning comprehension. He moved directly to Pacquiao, and as he did, his eyes seemed to sharpen, to focus with new intensity on the face before him. He studied Pacquiao for what felt like an eternity, his gaze searching, comparing, matching something against an internal image. That's when Pacquiao saw it happen, the moment of recognition flickering across the supervisor's features like a match being struck in darkness. The supervisor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. His mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to speak but needed to process what he was seeing first. His hand rose to his forehead, and for a moment he seemed almost physically struck by whatever realization had just crashed into him. Behind him, the female officer noticed the supervisor's reaction and stepped closer, following his line of sight back to Pacquiao with sudden new urgency. It was the female officer who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying a tone of shocked recognition. "Oh my God," she said, her notebook falling slightly to her side. "You're Manny Pacquiao," the supervisor finished, his voice carrying an undertone of disbelief mixed with horror. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that seemed to horrify him even as he spoke it. The third officer, the one who had been examining the luggage, looked up from where he was carefully refolding a shirt. His face went pale, and he straightened immediately, as if suddenly made aware that he had been handling the personal belongings of someone significant. Pacquiao felt a strange sensation wash over him in that moment. Relief. Yes, finally, someone had recognized him, and presumably, that recognition would explain what was happening. But beneath the relief was something more complex, the understanding that he had been subjected to this interrogation precisely because the system had not recognized him. The technology, the databases, the screening protocols, all of it had failed to identify who he was, and consequently had treated him like any other suspect. The supervisor began, but his words seemed to fail him. He looked toward the female officer, then back at Pacquiao, then at the other officers, as if seeking confirmation that what he was seeing was real. "Sir, we have made a significant error." The female officer had turned pale, her earlier professional demeanor crumbling entirely. She began to speak rapidly, her words tumbling over each other. "Mr. Pacquiao, we didn't. The system flagged." She seemed unable to complete a coherent sentence, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile what she had just done with who she had just done it to. Pacquiao realized in that moment the magnitude of what had occurred. They hadn't recognized him. They had screened him, questioned him, searched his belongings, all while operating under whatever alert or flag the system had generated. And their shock now, the genuine horror visible on their faces, suggested that whoever or whatever had flagged him in the first place, it certainly wasn't because of Manny Pacquiao's legitimate identity. The supervisor ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested he was grappling with the implications of the situation. "Sir, we sincerely apologize. This should never have happened. You don't deserve," he stopped, seeming to recognize that his apologies were inadequate. "What happened?" Pacquiao asked calmly, his voice steady despite the waves of emotion that must have been flooding through him. "Why was I flagged?" The supervisor exchanged glances with the female officer, and in that exchange, Pacquiao could see them both realizing something. They weren't entirely sure. They had been following a protocol, executing a screening procedure, but the original reason for that procedure, the database alert, the flag that had initiated everything, was something they would need to investigate. "There's been an error in the system," the supervisor said finally, his voice now carrying genuine remorse. "A database flag, likely a case of mistaken identity or a clerical error. Your name matched something in the system that should never have flagged you. I can only offer my deepest apologies for this incident." The female officer moved to Pacquiao's bag and began carefully organizing the remaining items, her movements almost ceremonial, as if she were trying to demonstrate respect through her actions. "We should never have subjected you to this," she said quietly. "Your cooperation has been exemplary, but the fact remains that this entire screening was based on an error." Around them, beyond the partition, Pacquiao could sense the subtle shift in awareness that was spreading through the security checkpoint. A few officers had clearly figured out who had been detained, and word was spreading. What had been a routine secondary screening minutes ago was now rapidly becoming an incident, a moment of institutional embarrassment that would likely ripple through the chain of command. The supervisor straightened, seemingly forcing himself to regain some semblance of professional composure despite the visible mortification coursing through him. "Mr. Pacquiao, we will clear you immediately. You are completely free to proceed to your gate. Again, I cannot apologize enough for this error." Pacquiao nodded slowly, processing everything that had just occurred. The worst was apparently over. The confusion was apparently being resolved. And yet, as he looked at the faces of the officers around him, their embarrassment, their horror at their mistake, he felt something unexpected, not anger but a kind of sympathetic understanding. They were human beings who had been following protocols, and the system itself had failed them. The real problem wasn't these officers. It was the mechanism that had flagged him in the first place. And none of them still seemed entirely certain why that had happened. The supervisor took a step back, his hand still touching his forehead as if the weight of his realization was physically pressing down on him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the genuine distress of someone who understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. "Sir, I am deeply, profoundly sorry," he began, his words measured but heavy with contrition. "There has been a significant misunderstanding, an error of substantial proportions that should never have resulted in your detention." The female officer moved closer, her earlier professional distance completely dissolved. In its place was an almost desperate desire to explain and apologize simultaneously. "Mr. Pacquiao, we were operating under a database alert that your name had been flagged in our system. We followed protocol precisely as we were instructed to do so, but the underlying flag itself," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "The underlying flag appears to have been based on a clerical error. A case of mistaken identity, or a data entry mistake in the system." Pacquiao remained silent, allowing them space to continue their explanation. He had expected anger to rise within him. He was a man accustomed to being recognized, to being treated with the respect that his decades of accomplishments had earned him. But as he watched these officers struggle through their apologies, he found something unexpected blooming in his chest: understanding. They hadn't known who he was. They had simply been doing their jobs, following the protocols they had been trained to follow. We should never have detained you based on a database flag without thoroughly investigating its origins first, the supervisor continued, his voice growing steadier as he moved into explanation mode. I take full responsibility for this lapse in judgment. When I finally recognized you, I immediately realized that whatever system alert had been generated was almost certainly erroneous. Your profile, your identity, there is no logical reason you would ever be flagged for secondary screening. The heavyset officer, the one who had been conducting the bag search, stepped forward. His face was flushed, his embarrassment palpable. Sir, I sincerely apologize for the invasive nature of the search. Every item in your bag was handled with appropriate procedures, but the necessity of the search itself was based on this erroneous flag. I am deeply sorry. Other officers had begun to gather at the edges of the secondary screening area, drawn by the shift in energy, by the sudden realization that something significant had occurred. A few whispered among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting toward Pacquiao. Word was spreading through the security checkpoint like wildfire. The legendary boxer had been detained due to a system error. The supervisor seemed to realize that his apologies alone were insufficient. He moved toward a small office area adjacent to the secondary screening space and returned with a laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with urgent purpose. I'm looking into the specific database entry that flagged you, he said, his eyes scanning the screen. I want to understand precisely what error resulted in this situation. Pacquiao watched him work, and within moments, the supervisor's face registered shock. Here it is, he said, turning the laptop slightly so that the female officer could see the screen. Their expressions darkened simultaneously. The supervisor looked back at Pacquiao with an expression that somehow managed to convey even greater embarrassment than before. Mr. Pacquiao, this is almost beyond belief, the supervisor said slowly. Your name was flagged due to what appears to be a duplicate entry in the system. A data entry clerk, apparently working through a backlog of international travelers, entered your information twice with slightly different spelling variations. One entry was correctly marked as cleared. The other was marked with an alert flag for further investigation. The algorithm pulled the flagged entry during random secondary screening selections this morning. The female officer closed her eyes briefly, as if the explanation was causing her physical pain. So you were selected at random, but the random selection pulled a data point that should never have existed in the system in the first place. This is a catastrophic failure at multiple levels of our security protocols. A higher-ranking officer, a woman with captain's insignia, had appeared in response to the commotion. She moved directly to Pacquiao, her expression grave and her bearing formal. Mr. Pacquiao, I am Captain Helena Rodriguez, shift supervisor for this terminal. I have just been briefed on what has occurred, and I want to offer my personal apologies. This incident reflects a serious systemic failure, and I can assure you that we will be conducting a thorough investigation into how this data duplication occurred and how it remained undetected by our quality assurance protocols. Pacquiao held up a hand gently. Captain Rodriguez, I appreciate your sincerity. I understand that you were all following procedures. The system itself failed, not the people operating it. I don't hold any of you responsible for a clerical error in the database. The generosity of his response seemed to affect the officers profoundly. Several of them exchanged glances, their shoulders relaxing slightly as they absorbed the fact that Pacquiao was not angry, was not demanding compensation or threatening to escalate the situation. The female officer's eyes glistened slightly, and she turned away for a moment, composing herself. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. Your grace in this situation is exemplary, sir. Nevertheless, this incident will be documented, and the database error will be immediately corrected. I will personally ensure that protocols are adjusted to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. The supervisor had continued investigating the database entry while the conversation was occurring. "The duplicate entry has been removed," he announced. "I've escalated this to the data management team, and they will be conducting a comprehensive audit of all recent entries to identify any other potential duplicates that might have slipped through." Additional officers began to arrive, drawn by curiosity and the ripple effect of the incident. A few of them seemed to recognize Pacquiao, and recognition brought even deeper embarrassment. The realization that not only had they detained someone without cause, but that someone was Manny Pacquiao, one of the most respected figures in international sports. "Mr. Pacquiao, on behalf of this entire terminal and the TSA, I want to offer my sincere apologies," Captain Rodriguez said, her voice carrying official weight. "You have every right to file a formal complaint, and if you choose to do so, we will fully cooperate with any investigation. Your cooperation and patience during this ordeal have been appreciated and noted." Pacquiao smiled gently, a gesture that seemed to ease some of the tension that had gripped the secondary screening area. "I appreciate everything you've said, Captain. I understand how these errors can occur. What matters is that you recognized the mistake and corrected it. That speaks well of your operation." The supervisor approached again with Pacquiao's bag, now fully repacked and organized. He presented it to Pacquiao with both hands, a gesture that somehow communicated respect and apology simultaneously. "Sir, you are completely cleared. You should proceed immediately to your gate. Your boarding time is approaching, and we want to ensure you make your flight without further delay." As Pacquiao took his bag and prepared to leave the secondary screening area, he noticed something remarkable. The officers seemed genuinely relieved that he had accepted their apologies gracefully. There was no anger in the space anymore, no tension. Instead, there was only the human experience of mistake and forgiveness, of systems failing and people responding with humility. The female officer spoke one final time as Pacquiao turned to leave. "Thank you for your patience and your understanding, Mr. Pacquiao. You are a credit to your character." Pacquiao nodded in acknowledgement, and with that gesture, he stepped out of the secondary screening area and back into the main flow of the airport terminal. The supervisor's fingers moved across the keyboard with methodical precision, each keystroke a step toward resolving the bureaucratic nightmare that had unfolded. Pacquiao stood nearby, watching the process unfold, acutely aware that time was passing and his boarding call would come sooner rather than later. Around him, officers continued to work with an almost frantic urgency, as if they could somehow compensate for the earlier error through the speed and thoroughness of their actions now. "I'm cross-referencing your information across all international databases," the supervisor explained, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Your passport number, your biographical data, your travel history. Once I verify that all of your records are clean and that you match your proper database entry, you'll be completely cleared." The female officer had moved to a filing cabinet and was pulling documents with rapid efficiency. "I'm pulling your official TSA profile," she said. "Once we verify that you have no flags, no outstanding alerts, and no security concerns in any of our systems, the clearance will be official and documented." Captain Rodriguez stood nearby, her arms folded, her expression serious and focused. She was clearly taking this situation personally, treating it as an institutional failure that required her direct oversight and attention. "I'm also initiating a protocol review," she said to one of the other officers. "I want a full audit of our database management procedures. This kind of data duplication should never have persisted in our system." Seconds ticked past. Pacquiao glanced at his watch. It had been perhaps 3 minutes since he had been initially pulled aside at the security checkpoint. 3 minutes felt like an eternity in the context of an airport experience, but he knew that the verification process would likely take longer than that. There was protocol to follow, paperwork to complete, databases to check. The machinery of security, for all its flaws, was designed to be thorough. The supervisor looked up from the laptop, his expression lighter than it had been minutes before. "Your international travel records are clear. No flags, no alerts. Your passport is valid, your entry and exit records are all accounted for, and there are no outstanding security concerns associated with your profile." Cross-referencing with Interpol databases, the female officer added, still working at her terminal. "Interpol records are clear. No watch lists, no alerts, no security flags of any kind." Pacquiao found himself appreciating the precision of the verification process, even though it had been triggered by an error. The system was designed to be thorough, to check and double-check, to verify information across multiple databases. It was comprehensive to the point of paranoia, perhaps, but in moments like this, that comprehensiveness served a purpose. It provided absolute certainty that an error had been made and that it had now been corrected. "CDC health records," the supervisor continued, checking another database. "All current, no travel restrictions based on health status." Another minute passed, then another. Pacquiao was now acutely aware of the time elapsed, 5 minutes since the supervisor had begun the verification process. The checkpoint beyond the partition continued its normal operations, but he could sense the awareness of his presence spreading through the terminal. A few other TSA officers had gathered near the partition, and at least 2 of them were looking in his direction with obvious recognition. "Financial records check," the female officer announced. "No flags related to sanctions or terrorist financing. Everything is clean." The heavy-set officer who had searched Pacquiao's bag approached with a clipboard. "I've documented the search," he said quietly. "All items were handled in accordance with TSA protocols, and nothing suspicious was discovered. I'm nodding in the official record that the search was conducted properly, but was initiated based on erroneous database information." Captain Rodriguez moved to the laptop and examined the supervisor's progress. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the thoroughness of the verification. "We're being comprehensive," she said to Pacquiao, her voice carrying professional certainty. "I understand this is time-consuming, but I want to ensure that every database confirms your status. This way, there can be absolutely no question that you have been fully cleared and that the error has been completely corrected." 7 minutes had now elapsed. The supervisor leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression shifting to something resembling cautious optimism. "Mr. Pacquiao, I have verified your information across 7 separate databases. Everything comes back clean. Your records are completely clear. There is absolutely no legitimate reason for you to have been flagged for secondary screening, and the error that caused your selection has been identified and is being corrected." The female officer pulled a form from a printer, the document still warm from its creation. "This is your official clearance documentation," she said, holding the page with reverence. "This certifies that you have passed secondary screening and have been cleared to proceed through the airport. Once you sign this, the documentation will be complete, and you will be free to board your flight." Pacquiao accepted the pen she offered and signed the document with a practiced hand. His signature, once placed on the form, seemed to carry the weight of finality. The female officer accepted the document back, reviewed it, and then handed it to Captain Rodriguez for her official sign-off. 8 minutes had elapsed. Captain Rodriguez examined the documentation with careful attention, verifying that every field had been completed correctly, that every database check had been documented, that every verification step had been recorded. She affixed her signature and her official seal to the document. When she looked up, there was something almost ceremonial in her bearing. "Mr. Pacquiao, you are officially cleared," she said formally. "This incident has been documented, the database error has been identified and corrected, and you have been fully exonerated. You are free to proceed to your gate without any restrictions or further delays." 9 minutes had elapsed since the supervisor had begun the verification process. Exactly 9 minutes from the moment Pacquiao had been pulled aside to the moment he was officially cleared. The supervisor stepped forward and extended his hand. Pacquiao shook it, and in that handshake, Pacquiao could feel the genuine relief flowing through the man. "Thank you for your patience, sir. Thank you for understanding that we were following protocol." The female officer also extended her hand, her eyes carrying gratitude mixed with lingering embarrassment. Other officers gathered around, each offering their apologies and their acknowledgement of the error that had occurred. As Pacquiao turned to leave the secondary screening area, he noticed something remarkable. The entire checkpoint seemed to have become aware of what had happened. Other travelers were watching, some with recognition dawning on their faces as they realized exactly who had been detained. A few pulled out their phones, and Pacquiao could see them capturing photos or video of the moment, though he chose not to acknowledge their presence. The officers escorted him toward the partition, and Captain Rodriguez walked him to the threshold between the secondary screening area and the main checkpoint. "Your gate information is on your boarding pass," she said. "You should have plenty of time to make your flight. Again, our apologies." Pacquiao nodded, and with each step toward the main checkpoint, he felt the weight of the ordeal beginning to lift. 9 minutes. That's all it had taken. 9 minutes for the system to recognize its error, correct it, and clear him completely. 9 minutes that would likely stay with him far longer than seemed proportional to the actual duration of the incident. He passed through the partition into the bright lights of the main checkpoint, his bag in hand, his boarding pass in his pocket, and the entire experience now officially behind him. The moment Pacquiao stepped back into the main security checkpoint area, his eyes immediately found his team. Maria, his personal assistant, was standing by the conveyor belt system, her luggage already processed and waiting on the other side. Ramon, his bodyguard, was positioned nearby, his broad frame slightly tense, his eyes scanning the checkpoint with the kind of protective vigilance that came with years of experience. When they spotted Pacquiao emerging from the secondary screening area, both of them moved toward him simultaneously, their faces a mixture of relief and urgent concern. "What happened?" Maria asked immediately, her voice carrying the anxiety of someone who had spent the last several minutes imagining worst-case scenarios. "Are you okay? Did something go wrong? Is there a problem with your visa?" Ramon placed a hand on Pacquiao's shoulder, his eyes searching for any sign of distress or injury. "Boss, are you all right? What did they do? Did they find something in your luggage?" Pacquiao smiled, a genuine warm smile that seemed to immediately deflate the tension that had been building in both of them. His composure, his complete lack of visible distress, served as an immediate reassurance that whatever had occurred, it had been resolved without incident. He took a breath, preparing to explain what had transpired, and his tone when he spoke was remarkably light, carrying almost an undercurrent of amusement rather than frustration or concern. "A database error," he said simply, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "The system got confused. My name was flagged due to a clerical mistake, a duplicate data entry with a slightly different spelling. The officers were doing their jobs. They screened me properly, thoroughly, professionally. It's all been cleared now." Maria's eyes widened slightly. "A database error. They detained you for a database error." "They were following protocol," Pacquiao explained, and in his explanation there was none of the blame or resentment that many people might have expressed in similar circumstances. Instead, there was understanding. "The system flagged me, so they had to investigate. It's how security works. They were thorough, they were professional, and once they realized the error, they corrected it immediately. There's nothing to be upset about." Ramon shook his head slightly, a gesture that suggested he couldn't quite believe how calmly Pacquiao was responding to what had been, objectively speaking, an inconvenience and an indignity. "Boss, they held you in secondary screening for nearly 10 minutes based on a computer glitch. That's how the system works," Pacquiao interrupted gently. "And the system, despite its flaws, ultimately worked correctly. The error was identified, investigated, and corrected. Those officers were polite, professional, and genuinely apologetic once they realized the mistake. What more could I ask for?" His team exchanged a glance, and Pacquiao could see the moment they understood something fundamental about their leader's character. He was not someone who was easily angered by systemic errors or human mistakes. He was someone who could maintain perspective, who could recognize that people were doing their jobs, and who could appreciate that when errors occurred, the response of those involved was what truly mattered. As they began walking toward the gate area, other travelers began to recognize Pacquiao. A few did double takes, their eyes widening as they realized exactly who had been detained in secondary screening. An older woman, perhaps in her 70s, approached cautiously. "Mr. Pacquiao, I just wanted to say I watched your entire career. You're a legend." Pacquiao stopped and engaged with her warmly, his attention fully present despite the fact that he was technically in transit and should have been moving toward his gate. He shook her hand, answered her questions about his career, and engaged with her in a conversation that lasted several minutes. When he finally excused himself to continue toward the gate, the woman was beaming, completely unaware of the security incident that had just unfolded. Maria hurried alongside him as they navigated the terminal. "Did they apologize? Did they treat you respectfully?" "Absolutely," Pacquiao replied. "In fact, I felt almost sorry for them. Once they realized who I was and what had happened, they were mortified. The supervisor, the captain, the officers, they were all genuinely embarrassed by the error. I made sure to let them know that I understood they were following procedures, that the error was in the system, not in their actions." "You defended them?" Maria asked, slight disbelief coloring her tone. "Why wouldn't I?" Pacquiao responded. "They did nothing wrong. They followed protocol. The captain is already planning a comprehensive audit of their database procedures to prevent similar errors in the future. These are people who take their jobs seriously, and they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do." Ramon walked slightly ahead, clearing a path through the growing crowd of travelers who were beginning to recognize Pacquiao. The boxer's presence in the terminal had apparently become known, and more people were stopping to acknowledge him, to take photos, to express their appreciation for his career. Pacquiao greeted each one graciously, signing autographs when requested, taking photos when asked, never showing any sign of frustration about the delay this might cause. As they approached the gate area, they could see that Pacquiao's flight was still in the boarding process. They had, despite the security incident, arrived with plenty of time before the final boarding call. The gate agents, upon seeing who had arrived, seemed to perk up slightly, recognizing the famous boxer. Pacquiao checked his boarding pass and settled into one of the seats in the gate area. Maria and Ramon sat nearby, finally allowing the tension they had been carrying to dissipate. The incident, from their perspective, had been resolved successfully, and their boss seemed completely unbothered by what had occurred. A man in a TSA uniform approached Pacquiao, not the supervisor or Captain Rodriguez, but another officer who had apparently heard about what had happened. "Mr. Pacquiao, sir, I just wanted to apologize on behalf of the entire security team. We're very sorry for the inconvenience. I hope you can understand that we were following proper procedures." Pacquiao stood and extended his hand to the officer. "I appreciate you saying that. Your team handled the situation professionally and courteously. I have no complaints whatsoever. I understand that errors happen in systems, but what matters is how they're handled when they're discovered. Your team handled this well." The officer seemed visibly relieved, thanking Pacquiao and walking away with what appeared to be genuine gratitude for the kind words. Maria watched the interaction with a kind of admiration, realizing that her boss was not just a legendary fighter, but also a genuinely gracious human being. "You're not even angry, are you?" she observed quietly. Pacquiao settled back into his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Angry? Number should I be? A computer made a mistake. People discovered it and fixed it. Everyone involved was professional and polite. Why would I be angry?" "Because it was inconvenient. Because you were detained unfairly," Maria pointed out. "I was detained for 9 minutes due to a clerical error," Pacquiao acknowledged. In the grand scheme of my life, in the context of everything I've experienced, the fights, the losses, the victories, the struggles, 9 minutes of inconvenience seems utterly insignificant. And more importantly, those officers were just doing their jobs. They didn't deserve my anger for following protocol. Ramon leaned back in his seat, a slight smile on his face. "That's why you're a champion," he said simply, "not just in the ring but as a person." The gate agent began calling boarding groups, and Pacquiao gathered his belongings. As he approached the jet bridge, he could see through the windows that the flight attendants had been informed of his presence. They greeted him with genuine warmth and respect, and as he made his way to his seat, several passengers recognized him and offered words of support and admiration. The incident was behind him now. The 9 minutes of disruption had passed, the mystery had been solved, and Pacquiao had handled it all with the kind of grace and understanding that defined his character far more than any of his championship belts ever could. The aircraft door sealed behind Pacquiao with a soft hydraulic hiss, and he felt the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that indicated the cabin was being pressurized. He settled into his first-class seat, spacious, comfortable, a privilege earned through years of frequent travel, and watched the ground crew moving methodically around the tarmac below. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the world beyond the window was bathed in bright, clear light. In his pocket, his phone had been switched to airplane mode, severing his connection to the ground and the incident that had unfolded there just 30 minutes earlier. Around him, the other passengers were engaged in the ritual of early flight preparation. A few were settling into their seats and immediately closing their eyes, seeking sleep before departure. Others were organizing their belongings, adjusting their seat positions, or reviewing the safety information card with the kind of perfunctory attention that suggested they had done this thousands of times before. None of them seemed aware that they were traveling alongside Manny Pacquiao, or if they did, they were polite enough not to make a fuss during the boarding process. The flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Pacquiao, welcome aboard. Can I offer you something to drink? We have champagne, coffee, juice, whatever you prefer." "Coffee would be perfect," Pacquiao replied. "Thank you." As he sipped his coffee, Pacquiao gazed out the window at the tarmac and found his mind drifting back to the events of the morning. The incident, and he had already begun to think of it in those terms, as a discrete incident rather than as some traumatic event, seemed to have already taken on the quality of a memory, something that had happened rather than something that was currently happening. The immediate tension and uncertainty had been replaced by a kind of reflective curiosity about what it all meant. The boarding process continued, passengers moving down the aisle, stowing luggage, settling into their seats. The flow of humanity was predictable, routine, the same ritual that had been repeated millions of times across the globe. How many of these people, Pacquiao wondered, went through their days without ever being forced to question the systems they relied on? How many never thought about the clerical errors that might exist in databases somewhere, flagging innocent people for scrutiny? The captain's voice came through the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and providing the standard flight information. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Flight 847 to Manila. We're expecting a smooth flight with an estimated flight time of 14 hours and 20 minutes. We should be departing in approximately 5 minutes. Thank you for choosing our airline." Pacquiao closed his eyes as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. He could feel the subtle motion as the plane was guided by the tug vehicles toward the runway. The sound of the engines began to change, increasing in pitch and intensity as they prepared for takeoff. Around him, the cabin settled into that particular silence that characterized the moments just before flight. Everyone quiet, everyone still, everyone contemplating the remarkable act of becoming airborne. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with increasing speed. Pacquiao felt the familiar pressure as the nose lifted, that moment when the wheels left the ground and the laws of physics and aeronautics took over from the mechanics of ground transportation. The city below began to recede, becoming smaller, more abstract. The details that had seemed so significant, the airport terminal, the security checkpoint, the secondary screening area, all became miniaturized, distant, part of a landscape that was rapidly shrinking beneath the aircraft. As they climbed higher and higher, piercing through a thin layer of clouds, Pacquiao opened his eyes and gazed out at the world below. From this height, the distinctions that seemed so important on the ground lost their significance. The airport where he had been detained became indistinguishable from the thousands of other structures scattered across the landscape. The roads, the buildings, the people moving through their daily lives, all of it seemed remarkably small and insignificant when viewed from an altitude of 30,000 feet. And that, Pacquiao realized, was perhaps the most important perspective of all. The security incident, which had felt so disruptive and concerning just an hour ago, now seemed almost quaint. Yes, he had been detained. Yes, it had been based on an error. Yes, it had been inconvenient and intrusive. But in the grand tapestry of human experience, in the context of his own life and its arc, those 9 minutes were nothing. They were a blip, a moment, a minor disruption in a day that contained thousands of moments. What had truly mattered, Pacquiao reflected, was not the incident itself, but how it had been handled. The officers had been professional. The system, despite its flaws, had ultimately worked correctly. Errors had been identified, investigated, and corrected. And most remarkably, he had been presented with an opportunity to respond with grace and understanding rather than with anger and recrimination. The flight attendant returned, offering him lunch. Pacquiao requested a simple meal, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, brown rice, and returned his attention to the window. They were now at cruising altitude, the world below appearing as an intricate patchwork of fields, forests, water, and civilization. From this perspective, the human preoccupations that seemed so urgent on the ground took on a different character. Conflicts seemed less significant. Grievances seemed less weighty. A passenger across the aisle, a business traveler in his 50s, made eye contact with Pacquiao and seemed to recognize him. He nodded respectfully, and Pacquiao returned the nod with a smile. No autograph was requested, no fuss was made. Just a moment of mutual acknowledgement between two travelers on a journey to a shared destination. Pacquiao realized something important in that moment. The real victory of the morning had not been in the security clearance he had received or in the apologies he had accepted. The real victory was in the choice he had made about how to respond. He could have been angry. He could have demanded compensation or threatened to escalate the situation. He could have used his fame and influence to punish those responsible for his detention. But he hadn't. Instead, he had chosen understanding. He had chosen grace. He had chosen to see the humanity in people who were simply doing their jobs. And in making that choice, he had transformed a potentially negative situation into something else entirely. A moment that revealed character, that demonstrated the power of perspective, that showed what it looked like when someone responded to adversity with composure rather than combustion. The incident wouldn't make headlines. No cameras had captured the security officer's embarrassment or Pacquiao's gracious acceptance of their apologies. The story wouldn't trend on social media or become a subject of intense discussion. It would fade into the background of his life, one more unusual occurrence in a life that had been filled with unusual occurrences. And yet, for those officers who had been involved, for Maria and Ramon who had witnessed his response, for the passengers who had seen how a celebrity conducted himself when faced with inconvenience, the incident had meaning. It was a quiet triumph, not a victory against anyone or anything, but a triumph of character, of perspective, of human decency. Pacquiao settled back into his seat, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to rest.